Welcome to the Divorce Doctor podcast. I'm really excited to introduce you to our interviewee today. Renee Bauer is a divorce attorney, author, and host of the Happy Even After podcast. She's committed to educating and empowering women to use their divorce as an opportunity to create a life they love. Having gone through 2 divorces herself and having lived in the shame of it all, it's her mission to remove the stigma of divorce so no one has to suffer in silence. Thank you, Renee, for being here, and thank you for the work that you do.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Me too. I can't wait. So I always start the podcast asking everyone the same question, which is, what word would you use to describe your divorce?
Oh my gosh. To narrow it down to one word.
You can do 2 if you want. You can do
2. During the divorce, the word was broken. And after the divorce, the word is empowered.
Such a beautiful reminder of the process of divorce that we move through, that we can go from one state to another. So I want to ask you a little bit about, in my personal experience and a lot of my clients, there's this early kind of sound that we hear, this early nudge that something might not be right. But very often, and very much often for women, we kind of push it away. So when do you think you first started hearing a little something that maybe this relationship or the 2 relationships were not right?
So this is such a great question, and it's one that I really don't ever talk about. So there was an exact moment for my first marriage. The second marriage was like a blip on the radar. It happened so fast that I don't even don't even need to go there.
So your first marriage is really the one that you...
That was the one, right? Yeah. And that was the one that my son was born from. And I remember bringing him home from the hospital and driving at one point, I don't know where I was going, but thinking to myself, okay, I have everything I need now because I have my son, and that's it. That's all I need. And that thought, I knew something was wrong. I knew that thought down to its core was so indicative of what was happening inside of me and what was happening inside of my marriage. But yet at that moment, my son just being a newborn, it was like, okay, I'm good now. I don't need anything else. But we both know that fades. And at some point that's just not enough anymore.
Oh, I'm so honored that you were willing to be so honest about that, because I had the same experience and I never talk about that either. I remember sitting on the couch and breastfeeding my son and thinking, we don't need you. Like, we can do this on our own. It's just us. And as if that was comforting. And in the same moment, I thought, that's really a messed up thing for my poor son. Like, he doesn't need that responsibility. But I had that same feeling. So I thank you for sharing that and reminding me of that moment. When I don't think I didn't listen to it then, but that was another time for me. Yeah. So how long between that moment and when the tips or the realizations got stronger?
It was 2 years, because I got divorced when he was 2 years old. And so it was a 2-year process of really battling myself and what I knew. And what so many people often do is their head's telling them one thing and their heart's telling them something else. And so that was the conversation that was happening inside of me, is my head conflicting with my heart, which is, I think everyone goes through that.
Yeah. And I really want people listening to know that it takes time. I think there's this misconception, maybe looking back, I should have done it faster, or this is going so slow. Or if you have a friend who's going through a divorce and thinking it takes the time it takes until you just know. So was there a moment where you just knew?
I think there were multiple moments towards the end, and it was just taking that, like I picture it like there's a line on the ground and crossing over that line. It was like I'd stick my toe over and pull it back, and put an arm over and pull it back, and then finally just jump over it, because I knew nothing was going to change. And I knew that I was going to have to make this decision, and it's excruciating. But it's one that allows you to really step into your purpose in your most aligned life. But it doesn't come without heartache, and it doesn't come without all of the feelings that go along with divorce, the guilt, the shame, and all of that. So outside the other end, you can say, that had to happen. But when you're doing it, when you're at that point where your toes going over the line, it's not so easy.
No, not at all. So the word that's coming to mind is it's so brave. It's such a brave move to do that. And were you an attorney when you were getting divorced? Yeah.
Yes, I was.
So what was that like?
It's funny because as a lawyer, and I do talk about this, I showed up for work a certain way. I was all buttoned up. I went to court, all suited up and click clacked, my heels down the hallway and did my job. But I was really this broken version of myself. So I had kept such separate lives. Like my work world was my work world and my professional world I kept in, and I kept quiet about it for so long because I thought that it's unprofessional. You don't do that. You don't talk about your story. Clients don't want to hear that. You're not taught in law school to share your personal life. Like this is something that you keep to yourself. And it wasn't until I opened the door and allowed both of those worlds to blend was when I really healed. And that took a while to get to that point.
I'm so glad you're bringing this up about the compartmentalizing that I think so many people do. Because of messages we're sent, like you said, about professionalism. And also, I think to survive, because it feels like if you feel those feelings during work, it'll obliterate you. And so I really want people to know that if you're doing that, you're not alone. And it also really taxes your nervous system. So compartmentalization it's a great survival skill for trauma, but it does use a lot of your nervous system energy. So if you're exhausted from it, I don't know if that's what your experience was, Renee, like that makes sense.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was exhausted. It was devastated. It was show up, put the smile on, step out into the world and look like you have it all together. And behind closed doors, you're sitting on the floor sobbing on weekends when you don't have your son. Like that's what that world looked like.
Yeah. So what was the hardest part for you that kind of brought you to your knees of the divorce, do you think?
I think it was my son. It was the guilt from that, that really, really was really hard. He was 2 years old at the time. And it was that first weekend where he wasn't with me. It was really hard. And that one of the weekends was a long weekend. It was Labor Day. And he was going away with his dad, and he was totally safe with his dad. And there weren't any problems or questions or concerns there, but it was like my son was having an experience without me. And I wasn't there to share. And my ex would send me photos and say, oh, look at hey, he's having a great time, which was amazing and unbelievable. And, I was so grateful for it. However, when you receive those, it's like, oh, look at him smiling and he's not there with me. Yeah. And that was really, really hard to reconcile for a while, and especially with him being such a young age.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this up because it is so excruciating, right? Those first 1, 2 times, 2 months, 4 months, 4 years, like whatever it is, like it can continue to be excruciating when you have to separate. And I think a lot of people stay because of that fear. Yeah. And I think that I encourage my clients to really lean into that it makes sense. You have an attachment bond with this kid. They're going to be okay and you're going to be okay, but allow yourself to feel those feelings. So my son was 2.5 and my daughter was 6 months. And it was just so hard to be apart from them. So I really can relate to that. So what kind of healing, like once you were separated, what kind of healing did you pursue for yourself? Psychological healing, spiritual healing?
Yeah. So I love this question because this is what I teach anyone that I work with, is to start to date yourself and start to really tap into all of the things that you always wanted to do, but never had time for. When you're married and you're raising kids, you never have time for the things, like whether it's running the marathon or writing the book or whatever it is. So that's what I did. I started yoga, had never done it before. And I was not from the state that I live in. So my entire support system was out of state. So I had to rebuild an entire base of friends. And I didn't have family around me. So when I started yoga, I started to make friendships there and started to do things with those people. I wrote my first book during that first 6 months of divorce. So I would sit there and alternate between crying and then writing. But that was the healing process. I've always been a writer. I always knew I wanted to write a book and never made the time or space for it. And I said, you know what better time than now? I have this time to use. So let me use it in a productive and creative way. So I tapped back into something that has always filled me up. So I really started to, and then I started training for a half marathon. I just started to do things.
Yeah.
And that was it. Rather than sit in the kind of that ickiness, I started to just put one foot in front of the other and say, I'm going to sign up for the class. I'm going to do the activity. I'm going to go zip lining. Like I'm going to just start to do stuff. And eventually, like I even started having fun with it. And then you start to forget like, oh, I'm so miserable or I'm so broken. And you start to actually enjoy life and activities and friends and people again. And I think that's where the healing comes in.
That's amazing. And what I'm thinking about, Renee, is that, in your relationship, you described when you had your son, feeling like he was everything that you needed. So that sounds like in the marriage, there was already this kind of separate, emotional separation, right?
Yeah.
And now your situation just matched how you felt, but you could own that and be in it and do what you needed to do. Like, it sounds like you really gave yourself permission to have the life you wanted all the time without feeling guilty that you weren't bringing him along.
Yeah. And, I don't know if I would be where I am today, if I would have the business that I have, if I would be doing any of those things had I stayed in that marriage. In fact, I know that I would not have. And none of it was easy. And, and I think that's the point, that all of this, the journey that you go on, it can be really, really hard. I had just started my business when I got divorced. So my business was like barely surviving. It was like, all right, what am I going to do to make sure I have enough money and, start to hustle there. But I started just putting that effort in. And then once you see that struggle start to pay off and you start to see, oh, okay, like I can do this, I can be okay. And that's where the growth comes. And I think that's where the magic happens, because you've put yourself in a really uncomfortable place, but you then become like the best version and most empowered version of yourself because of that discomfort.
That's so well said. I mean, I think I have this quote in my book about, there's no lotus without any mud. Right? That there needs to be mess before there's a beauty. And so your story is such a great example of that. And you mentioned that you had a second divorce after. So did you marry someone after that? So was there anything about that relationship that you've learned about kind of the next relationship after divorce? Anything that taught you?
Yeah. So it's funny because that marriage was fast. It was a classic, love bombing situation. It was the marriage happened quickly. I got out quickly. I ignored the red signs initially. And then when I saw what was happening, I got out really fast. There was so much shame from that. So much shame, even more than the first, because it was like, why can't I get this right? What's wrong with me? I'm not meant for love. I'm not meant for marriage. However, that relationship, I don't regret. And I'm almost can say that I'm grateful for it, because it has taught me to really be unwavering in what I need and what I'm looking for. And so I am remarried. I am remarried to the perfect match. Now, I would say not perfect person, my perfect match. But when I showed up to that relationship, I was very clear about what I needed, what I wanted, what I was going to give. And I learned from the mistakes that I made in the past too, so that it could be a really, really healthy relationship. So there aren't any regrets. Every step of the way has been a growth experience.
And how did you heal that shame that you were carrying about the second relationship?
So talking about it. So this is the crazy part about this, is I didn't talk about it. I was kind of like I kept it quiet. I didn't share it with anyone. And then I started talking about it. A good friend of mine said, I have a podcast, come on, I'll interview you. I'll bring some sushi over. We'll have a couple drinks. And I'm like, sure. I don't listen to podcasts. Sure. That's fine. And she comes over, we eat a whole bunch of sushi. She's sticks the mic on me and she starts asking me questions about my divorces. And for the first time ever, I started talking about them. And I had women reach out to me and say, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing the vulnerability and the shame of it. And then that's when I realized I need to not keep these stories to myself. I need to share them. And from just talking them and speaking them, there's another whole level of healing that happens from that.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that. The antidote to shame is to put yourself out there and get positive feedback. I see this in my membership group all the time when people come with something that they feel icky sharing, and how being loved up by all the other women just releases
Yeah.
that shame. So what a great story and what a great experience. So I want to ask you, what was the part of that's come from the divorce that changed you, that you couldn't even see coming, but actually changed you for the better?
Hmm. I think that, I think there was always a part of me that was always afraid of being judged. And this goes back to
Mm.
some generational,
Yep.
stuff. But it was always, I grew up in a family where it was always judgment, always worried about what people think. And
Mhm.
so I had some of that.
Mm.
And not even recognizing that I didn't want that. It was just kind of like, okay, this is just the way I am because this is how my parents were, or
Yep.
and so that was the piece of it that I really was able to let go and drop
Mm.
and say, you know what, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. Doesn't matter who's saying what. I'm going to be the most authentic and most real version of myself.
Mhm.
And whoever has an issue with it, then that's their problem, not mine. And those people can fall away. So that has been such a huge relief, is to shed that part.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. Like, would you have ever released that if you hadn't gone through the divorce? I think about that a lot. That this idea
Yeah.
of, I remember when I went through the divorce thinking something is wrong with me. I failed. Just thinking in that really dichotomous way of thinking. And if you embrace your divorce and lean into it, you
Mhm.
can't think in a dichotomous way anymore.
Right, right. Yeah, that's such a great point.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, I always like to ask people the same question, which is, if you could have, with all the wisdom you have from your experience, from the people you teach, you could go back to that younger version of you when you were thinking about divorce or going through it and feeling broken, what message would you give her?
Don't doubt yourself. Trust that what you're feeling is real and it is validated. Because I think so often when someone stays stuck in an unhealthy relationship or one that isn't serving them, it's because they're doubting their own inner voice and they're doubting their intuition. And if you just trust yourself and trust that voice, you will never make a wrong decision. You will be guided to the right decision in the right path, and you will come out the other side. And as soon as we infuse the doubt and the naysayers and our own internal critic, that's when we
Yeah.
start to kind of waver.
That's so wise. And it's making me think about how judgment and intuition are just, they can't work together,
Yeah.
right? That when you release your judgment of yourself and
Hmm.
others, you can hear yourself better.
Yeah, yeah. And then when you start making decisions from that aligned place,
Mhm.
then you can trust that everything's going to work out. Doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, but it will work out if you just lean into that and trust that, okay, I'm making a decision because I know it's the right thing to do for me, and
Mhm.
everything else will fall into place without having expectations or answers for everything. You don't need to know what the future looks like. You don't even need to know where you're going to be living. You don't need to know what your alimony order looks like. You don't need to have those specifics to really understand and trust that it will all work out exactly the way it's supposed to.
Mm, thank you. Is there any last messages that you might want to share with our audience before we sign off?
Oh, just to remember that in the darkest times, there's always light. And we couldn't have the light and the joy if we didn't also have the roller coaster and the bumps along the way. So embrace every moment of it because you'll always come out of it.
Thank you so much, Renee. I'm going to put all of your information about how people can reach you in the show notes, but can you just share a little bit about how people might be able to reach out if they wanted to work with you and how they could do that?
Sure. Instagram's kind of my favorite place to hang out, where you can link up to all of my stuff. And my handle is at Ms. Renee Bauer.
Thank you so much, Renee, for being honest and sharing your vulnerability and being willing to be here today and share your story.
Thank you.